It has been 1 month since the end of the world. 30 long days since Stella had watched her husband dissolve in front of her. 1 minute mowing the lawn like it was any other lazy afternoon, and the next collapsing into a useless pile of flesh and jelly. The end didn't come like she always thought it would, with hellfire raining down and pale riders galloping across the land on horseback. It began in the kitchen, with her humming a song to herself, mixing up a pitcher of lemonade before she rejoined her family in the sunshine. Then they were gone, lost forever when the sun turned wrong. She didn't even have time to grieve them properly before the threat turned on her, as the creatures that had once been her husband, her son, and her daughter swarmed the door, slamming their new bodies against the wood with wet slaps, calling out to her in warped voices, begging her to step back outside. She covered her ears and wept for hours, until she had no tears left to cry. It didn't take long for Stella to figure out that whatever had happened to her family, it was happening all over the world. The small town she had known and loved had transformed into a hellscape, a maze of monsters and deadly light. She retreated underground, to old mine shafts and tunnels, left abandoned decades ago when the local coal trade had dried up. There, she quickly discovered that she wasn't the only one with that idea. There were others, survivors, who had managed to make their way down into the dark, away from the horrors above. There weren't many, and she could never get too attached to the ones she did meet, in case they too were lost to the sun. But as the days wore on in the tunnels, she found herself forming a small group of stragglers. Not quite a family, but something that could be one day, and definitely much better than going it alone. There was Stella, of course, using her background as an elementary school teacher to keep everyone on track and working together. Then there was Brian, a former volunteer firefighter, whose training and skills with an axe came in handy more than once. There was Trina, a teenage girl who had been babysitting when everything went to hell, who had a knack for evading the flesh monsters and making supply runs. And then there was Doris, former military nurse and current de facto team medic, sharp and capable, in spite of being in her late 70s. They were brave people, brilliant, and refused to give up. Others came and went, spare survivors they picked up as they navigated their way, raiding the ruins of grocery stores and hospitals, but they always wound up leaving again. Or, worse, something would go wrong, and the sunlight would claim another victim. But the 4 of them stayed together, stronger with their combined skills, willpower, and ability to sleep in shifts and keep an eye out for trouble. After some time in the tunnels, the group had come across a massive abandoned facility. None of them could determine where it came from or what organization might have run it, but it appeared to have been some kind of research lab. It was isolated, cut off from outside influences better than any of their previous hideouts had been. Whoever had once worked here had cleared out, or been taken out in a hurry. But in their place, they had left behind rations, medical equipment, emergency generators, and clean drinking water. There were enough supplies to keep the group going for months, if they rationed carefully. And so they settled in. The abandoned research facility, whatever it once was, became their makeshift home. This unexpected sanctuary was cut off from the rest of the world. Clinical, cold, lonely, but a safe place for them to rest their heads. Now it had been a month since this all began. Stella shook her head at this realization, the passage of time feeling almost meaningless at this point. What did a month even mean anymore? What was a day when she couldn't even see the sun rise and set? As she sat there warming herself by the side of a foraged space heater, she thought about missing the stars, the moon, the promise of the cosmos. A time when the vast open sky was an invitation to dream instead of something to hide from. That time was gone now. There was nothing to do but mourn it and carry on, if not for her, then for the others. They had all found ways to keep busy in this new place. Trina took to exploring the empty halls, the laboratories filled with strange equipment, the small rooms that looked like prison cells or police interrogation rooms. She had cooked up some theory about it being a government facility, like something out of an old episode of The X-Files. Brian had found an on-site library, filled with history books and scientific texts. There was enough to read in there. He said that by the time he was finished, he would have the equivalent of several doctorate degrees. Doris had taken initial stock of all the medical supplies available at the site. Gauze, disinfectant, vials upon vials of medications she had never heard of, and had categorized them all neatly. Now she spent her hours mostly sitting with Stella, telling her stories about whatever she felt like. Her time overseas, her late husband, their children, decades-old neighborhood gossip. It felt good to talk, no matter what it was about. It felt human. They all had their ways of keeping their grip on their own humanity. It had almost gotten boring, holed up in the facility without the constant threat of danger pressing in from all sides. Boring, but peaceful. Stella could feel herself starting to nod off, her eyelids sagging, her dinner of canned beans sitting heavy in her stomach. Next to her, Doris had already begun to softly snore. Soon sleep would come for her too, and bring with it dreams, memory of the life that was gone forever, the world as she had once known it. The dreams were tough, but waking up from them was even tougher. Still, she had to rest. She could only fight it for so long. She could almost hear her husband's voice when, "Hey, Stella, you might want to see this." Brian was there suddenly, his words breaking through the haze in her mind. His tone was severe, and she knew that sleep would have to wait. She followed him down the hall for a while, before he stopped and turned her attention to a section of a damaged wall. It was rusted and corroded, black and gray with massive cracks in the solid material. It looked like it had been slowly disintegrated over time by an incredibly strong acid. It was off-putting to look at, giving off the distinct sense that something bad had happened. But a lot of bad things had happened in the past month. "I don't really understand what I'm looking at," Stella said, and Brian grabbed her by the shoulders, commanding her attention. "This wasn't here yesterday. Hell, it wasn't here a few hours ago." He gestured to the damage. "It just happened, and whatever is responsible is probably still here." A chill ran down Stella's spine. It seemed impossible for this kind of structural damage to happen over the course of a few hours. She could see twisted steel rebar, drips of melted metal that had trickled onto the floor. As she leaned in for a closer look, she gagged. There was an overpowering stench of rot and decay. It didn't take long for her to spot the source, a thick, black mucus covering the hole in the wall, slick and slimy, and giving off the putrid smell. It wasn't like the material that had made up the flesh creatures outside. It was something else entirely. Something she had never seen before. She reached out a hand to touch it, but quickly caught herself. Whatever this stuff was, it was bad news. If it could do that to a solid wall, she didn't even want to think about what it could do to flesh and bone. "What do we do?" she asked. "Inspect the area, make sure it's safe, see if it's some kind of toxic waste leak or..." He didn't finish the thought. He didn't have to. They needed to find out if this damage came from something living, something that could be hiding in the building with them and waiting for the chance to strike. When they returned to the main room, Doris was awake and Trina was there waiting for them. They agreed to split into pairs and search the facility, looking for any additional damage, strange black fluid, or signs of foul play of any kind. Trina and Brian went one way, while Doris and Stella went the other, each person armed with a flashlight and a weapon of some kind. An axe, a bat, a knife. Stella had found a loaded pistol when they first arrived, one that she hoped she would never have to use. Now she carried it with her, just in case. Stella and Doris walked together for an hour, keeping an eye out for anything suspicious. They didn't find anything notable, really. There were some bits of rust they hadn't seen before, an occasional black puddle pooling on the floor, but nothing like the scene Brian had found. As they walked in silence, Stella found herself beginning to relax. Maybe the worst was over. Maybe a pipe had broken somewhere and broken down a bit of the wall, but nothing else would really come of it. Then, from the other side of the building, there came a high-pitched scream. She knew that voice immediately. Trina, screaming bloody murder, and Brian bellowing something. She grabbed Doris by the arm, and the two ran in the direction of the sound. As they got closer, they could hear other sounds in addition to Trina and Brian's yells. Loud cracking like something solid coming apart, bits of rubble falling to the ground, and the wet dripping sound of something thick hitting the floor. As the two rounded the corner to see what was happening to help their friends, Stella froze in shock. She had seen some harrowing things since that fateful sunny day, She almost thought she had become desensitized to horror, that there was nothing left in the world that could faze her, but this moment proved her wrong. There was so much to take in and so little time. Brian was swinging his axe wildly at the floor, chopping at it helplessly in an attempt to break it apart. It quickly became obvious why. Trina was sinking into the floor, not through a hole into the basement below, but into the floor itself. It rippled and melted around her, changing from a solid surface to a thick pool of black sludge. She flailed and struggled, grasping at the ground around her, at Brian's arm, anything to yank herself free. But she wouldn't budge. She continued to sink. No, she wasn't just sinking. She was being pulled. Stella felt her legs begin to work again, and she rushed to Trina's side, grabbing hold of her arms with all the strength she had. All the while, Trina screamed in a mix of desperation, terror, and pain. Brian continued his assault on the ground, as if he could cut her free from the floor, and Doris moved to help Stella. She grabbed a hold of Trina's waist, but stopped suddenly. There, at the place where her body vanished into the floor, Trina was beginning to fall apart. Whatever had turned the floor into a portal, whatever had rotted away at the walls, it was taking its toll on her body too. The flesh falling away from the bone, the muscles liquefying, and everything becoming corrupted by that same black mucus. If they pulled any harder, Trina would be ripped in two, her chest, arms, and head on the surface, while her legs, stomach, and most of her vital organs were lost. There was no way to save her. Stella saw it when Doris did, and the two shared a long, sad look. Trina was here with them, still struggling for her life, but she was already gone. As if it felt their hopelessness, the force pulling on Trina from below then gave a horrifying yank they were praying to not have to witness, and she was swallowed up by the ground. All that remained was a sticky black smear, a large crack in the floor, and 3 survivors where there had just been 4. None of the remaining 3 slept a wink that night. Brian paced back and forth, holding his axe. Doris went over their supplies again, looking for anything that could be used to treat the effects of the corrosive black fluid, and Stella ran over their potential options again and again. They could stay and hope that the thing that took Trina never came back, or they could leave and face the possibility of succumbing to the sun or the influence of the creatures that once were people. She recalled dimly an old adage, "The devil you know beats the devil you don't." Maybe that was true. Maybe it would be better to take their chances with the outside rather than stay and be hunted. But she thought of her husband and children again, watching them melt onto the grass, and she shuddered. There were no good options here, but she couldn't risk going out like that. They would stay. Whatever had taken Trina, there were 3 of them, and only 1 of it. Besides, maybe it had already gotten what it wanted, and now it would move on. She didn't know it when she fell asleep, only that when she eventually woke up, she was alone. Brian and Doris were nowhere to be found. She called out their names as her heart leaped into her throat. For a moment, she feared the very worst. But then, Brian answered her. He had been patrolling, looking for signs of trouble, but he was fine. She asked if Doris was with him, and he went pale. He told Stella that Doris had gone to an on-site bathroom to get cleaned up hours ago, before he left. She should have been back by then. Without another thought, they took off towards the bathroom and saw their worst fear realized. The door to the room was gone, rotted away, and Doris was gone with it. She had been taken before she even had the chance to scream. They stood there, taking in the reality of what had happened with silent shock. Then, a sound from behind caused them to turn around. It was a raspy, hollowed-out sound, like air forced from a dying man's lungs. A dry, empty, evil chuckle from an inhuman throat. There they saw the creature that had stolen their friends. From a distance, Stella could have confused it for a man. A very old, very sick man, but still human. As it shuffled closer, however, that illusion was shattered. Its eyes were black voids, its skin gray and putrefied, its mouth a gaping, toothless maw of shriveled black gums, and it was laughing at them, like it was enjoying itself. There was the smell again, that overpowering reek of all things foul. Stella drew her pistol and fired several shots. She didn't have the best aim, especially not when her hands were shaking with fear, but one of the bullets found its target and hit the creature in the cheek. It hissed, not in pain, but a perverse amusement, as the lead tore a hole through its flesh like wet paper. Globs of black blood spattered everywhere, spreading the rot wherever they landed. To her side, she heard Brian cry out in pain. When she turned, he was clutching his right eye. Some of the liquid had hit him there, and it was already taking effect. Stella's stomach turned as she saw something white slide down the side of Brian's face, his eye melting out of its socket. The skin around it followed suit, softening like putty and dribbling away from the bloody muscle underneath. Brian collapsed to the floor as the creature continued to advance on them, laughing louder and louder. It knew that bullets couldn't kill it, knew that there was nowhere to run. Stella grabbed a hold of Brian's arms, prepared to carry her fallen friend to safety, but he stopped her. "I'm done for," he said quietly. "If you try to carry me, you are too." She shook her head, unwilling to leave him behind, and he touched her cheek, forcing a smile on his decaying face. I didn't think I'd make it this far. I wouldn't have without you. So run. Save yourself." She could hear the resignation in his voice and knew that he would not let her save him. I'll hold him off as long as I can," Brian promised, and with tears in her eyes, Stella turned and ran as fast as she could. As her feet pounded the ground, blood rushing in her ears, she could hear Brian screaming and cursing at the creature until his voice quickly faded into a wet gurgle, and then silence. Stella sat in the center of the room that she and the others had once shared, clutching her scavenged pistol in her hands. Every creak, every errant sound made her jump. It could be anywhere, come from anywhere. She had escaped from so much already, survived more than anyone was ever meant to, had lost her love, her friends, her home. She wouldn't lose herself too. She held her breath as she heard it, clear in the darkness. Drip, drip, drip. Her grip on the weapon tightened, and she readied herself. If she had to go down, she might as well go down swinging. The old man, whether he was a man, a monster, or death itself, wouldn't be taking her anywhere, not without a fight. Now go check out SCP-106, The Old Man Tale Until Death, and SCP-001 When Day Breaks for more on the Old Man and what happens to the world when the sun turns against humanity.